Today we are going to explore one of the greatest historical distortions taught in schools around the world, the truth behind the so-called medieval witches and what textbooks have preferred not to tell for centuries. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is an image. It is almost universal. It appears in school textbooks, in period films, and in countless hallway conversations. It is the image of a woman with a dark gaze, shrouded in shadows, being led to a terrible fate while a crowd watches her with a mixture of fear and judgment. Religious figures point accusing fingers. The scene takes place, as every child has learned at some point in their school life, in the Middle Ages, at some vague time between castles, knights, and great plagues. But what if this entire image were a lie? Not a small lie, the kind that can be corrected with a footnote. A lie of monumental scale engineered over centuries of historical confusion, narrative simplification, and political convenience. A distortion that erased the true victims, disfigured the real motivations of the persecutors, and placed the events in the wrong time, the wrong place, and for the wrong reasons. To understand what really happened, we must first dismantle what we think we know. The Middle Ages, for most people, are synonymous with superstition and religious violence. This period, roughly bounded between the 5th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, carries a reputation built much more by later narratives than by concrete evidence. It was the Renaissance thinkers and later, the Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries who coined the very term Dark Ages to describe everything that came before them. It was a deliberate rhetorical operation, a way to present themselves as light in opposition to the darkness of the past. And in this operation, the Middle Ages became a convenient repository for all the horrors that modern humanity wanted to leave behind. The bonfires, the Inquisition, the witches, everything was shoved into this box called medieval. The problem is that when historians opened this box and looked carefully at the records of trials, ecclesiastical archives, and secular reports that survived the test of time, what they found was a story completely different from the one taught in classrooms. The Great Witch Hunt, the one that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people across Europe, did not happen in the Middle Ages. It happened later, mainly between the 15th and 18th centuries, with its most devastating peak between 1550 and 1650. That is, during the same period as the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the birth of modern humanism. While Europe boasted of emerging from the medieval shadows, it was leading its neighbors to trials for supposed pacts with the devil. This chronological inversion is not a minor detail. It changes everything. It changes who the people behind the persecutions were. It changes the role of religious institutions. It changes the political and economic motivations that fueled the terror. And it changes, above all, the way we understand the victims. Women and men condemned based on accusations that, seen out of context, sound like collective delusion. But how did this confusion become so deeply entrenched in the collective imagination? How did generations of students learn, without questioning, that medieval Europe was the natural setting for these persecutions? The answer lies in layers. The first is the simplest, the chronic inaccuracy of teaching materials. For decades, school textbooks treated witch hunts as an automatic byproduct of the medieval mentality. Without precise dates, without real names, without political context, only the vague idea of bonfires and the implicit lesson that all of that was the doing of ignorant people who lived in dark times. The second layer is more subtle. It concerns the way societies construct narratives about themselves. Modern Europe needed a mirror that would make it look better, and the most convenient mirror was the Middle Ages. The darker the past seemed, the brighter the present would become. The third layer is the most unsettling. It suggests that the chronological confusion was not always accidental, that there were interests in keeping the focus of historical guilt on a period already closed so that it would not be necessary to look with discomfort at what was happening in the so-called civilized world. Because the truth, as we will see throughout this documentary, is that the most intense persecutions in European history were carried out by people who considered themselves modern, enlightened, and rational. And that perhaps is the hardest part to accept. The story begins, as so many difficult stories do, with an idea. For centuries, the Catholic Church had a very clear official position on witches, and that position will surprise anyone who learned history in the conventional way. It did not believe in them. Not in the sense most people imagine. For much of the so-called Middle Ages, the Church's institutional position was not to persecute women accused of witchcraft. It was, in fact, the opposite, to condemn the very belief in the existence of witches as a form of pagan superstition, incompatible with the Christian faith. This fact, verifiable in primary sources dating back to the 10th century, is one of the most ignored by popular narrative, and understanding it is the starting point for dismantling the entire structure of the lie that the previous chapter began to reveal. The most important document for understanding this position is called the Canon Episcopi. Drafted around the year 906 and incorporated into medieval canon law, it dealt with a belief circulating in certain communities of the time that there were women who, during the night, flew great distances mounted on animals, following a female figure associated with ancient pagan cults. The Church's response? A direct condemnation, yes, but not of the women in question, of the belief itself. The text declared that these stories of nocturnal journeys were illusions produced by the devil himself in the minds of gullible people. Believing in them was a grave theological error. Those who took these accounts as truth were yielding to pagan fantasy, not confronting a real threat. In practical terms, for much of the Middle Ages, an educated clergyman who heard someone claim that their neighbor flew at night to make pacts with the demon would be far more likely to rebuke the accuser than to investigate the accused. This is a radical inversion of what most people expect to find. And this is not a peripheral detail. The Canon Episcopi was copied and referenced by canonists for centuries. It was a pillar of medieval ecclesiastical jurisprudence. Its message was unequivocal. Witchcraft, as a real and organized supernatural phenomenon, did not exist. It was a fantasy. And Christians should not waste time with fantasies. But then how did we arrive at the bonfires? The answer lies in a slow and deeply political transformation that began to take shape in the 14th and 15th centuries. A change that was not religious in origin, but that used religious language as an instrument. To understand this change, one must understand the context. Late medieval Europe was a continent in multiple collapses. The Black Death had killed between a third and half of the population between 1347 and 1353. The feudal structure was disintegrating. The authority of the Church had been shaken by schisms, scandals, and reform movements that questioned Rome. The order that had organized European life for centuries was cracking at several points simultaneously. In times of deep crisis, societies seek explanations. And when natural explanations are not enough, the human mind turns to invisible agents, hidden forces, enemies concealed within the community itself. It was in this climate that an ancient idea began to take on new and terrifying contours. The idea that there was an organized network of devil worshippers working to destroy Christendom from within, not individual witches practicing folk healing, but a secret, hierarchical sect with nightly meetings where the most serious imaginary crimes against God and the natural order were committed. This idea did not arise from nothing. It was built over decades by a combination of theologians intent on showing institutional relevance, secular authorities interested in consolidating power, and local communities that needed explanations for everyday tragedies. And when this idea was documented, systematized, and converted into doctrine, the Canon Episcopi lost its protective force. The ancient warning against believing in witches had been overtaken by a new consensus. Witches were not pagan fantasy. They were a demonic reality, and fighting them was a sacred obligation. The great turning point occurred in 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII signed the Bull Summis Desiderantes Effectibus. The document officially recognized the existence of a witchcraft threat in the Holy Roman Empire and authorized 2 inquisitors to act with full powers to combat it. These 2 inquisitors were named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. 2 years later, in 1486, they would publish a book that would change the history of Europe. A manual that defined who the enemies were, how to identify them, how to interrogate them, and how to condemn them. Its name was Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, and with it, the world we knew would begin to become unrecognizable. In 1486, a work unlike any text Europe had produced circulated through the continent's monasteries, courts, and study halls. It was not a Bible or a philosophical treatise. It was a manual, a practical and detailed guide written with the technical coldness of a legal regulation to identify, prosecute, and condemn people accused of witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum, whose Latin title literally means the Hammer of the Witches, was written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor of the Holy Roman Empire. Jacob Sprenger, the second name on the cover, is today a matter of debate among historians. The available documents suggest that his participation was marginal, and that Kramer included his colleague's name to give the book an appearance of collegial authority. But who was Heinrich Kramer? The answer to this question reveals an irony that history rarely tells. Kramer was not a persecutor celebrated for his wisdom or balance. Before writing the Malleus, he had conducted a trial in Innsbruck in Tyrol, which ended in scandal. His tactics were considered so excessive and irregular that the local bishop himself intervened, ended the proceedings, and expelled Kramer from the region, declaring that his behavior had been improper and obsessive. In other words, the man who wrote the most influential manual in the history of witch hunting had been rejected by an ecclesiastical court for excessive zeal. This rejection, far from silencing him, seems to have fueled his determination. In the following years, Kramer produced the Malleus with a clear purpose: to build an argument so solid, so backed by theological and legal authorities that no court could ignore it. And to ensure that the book reached the world with the weight of papal approval, he included as a preface the bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus, signed by Innocent VIII 2 years earlier. This inclusion was a masterful editorial move. To any reader of the time, the presence of the papal document suggested official endorsement. In practice, the bull authorized inquisitorial action in certain regions, but did not validate the specific content of the Malleus. This distinction, however, was quickly erased in public perception. The book became, for all practical purposes of its time, the voice of the Church. And what did that voice say? Broadly speaking, the Malleus was divided into 3 parts. The first dealt with proving that witchcraft existed as a supernatural reality and that doubting it was, in itself, heresy. The second described the specific forms of maleficia that witches could practice. The third was a procedural guide: how to conduct a trial, how to treat the accused, how to obtain confessions. But there was one assertion that ran through the entire text like a backbone, and that, more than any other, would define the face of the persecutions to come. Witches were predominantly women. Kramer devoted a large part of the first book to constructing a theological argument for this conclusion. In his view, women were more susceptible to the devil's influence for combined natural and spiritual reasons. The argument mixed distorted readings of biblical texts with misogynistic stereotypes already present in the literate culture of the time, converting social prejudices into formal doctrine. The impact of this thesis was immense. In a society where the printed word carried an almost unquestionable weight of authority, the Malleus not only described a phenomenon, it defined and shaped it. Judges who would never have concluded on their own that witches were mostly women began to apply this assumption as established fact. Another decisive factor was the historical moment of publication. The Malleus Maleficarum came into the world only a few decades after Johannes Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press. It was one of the first texts to benefit from the technology that would forever transform the dissemination of ideas in Europe. Between 1486 and 1600, the book had at least 14 known editions. It reached courts, libraries, and religious institutions in multiple countries. An idea that without the press would have circulated among a handful of specialized inquisitors reached a continental audience. And in reaching that audience, it did not merely inform, it authorized. In the following decades, the persecutions that had until then been episodic and restricted to certain regions began to acquire a new coherence, a common vocabulary, a shared methodology, an enemy with a name, agenda, and behaviors defined in enough detail to serve as a script for any authority willing to act. The stage was set. What remained was to understand who in fact the victims were, because the image of the solitary old woman at the edge of the forest hides a reality far more complex and disturbing than any stereotype could contain. There was a face for the witch, a face that centuries of cultural imagination had built with such consistency that it seems always to have existed like this. Old, solitary, poor, on the margins of the community, an inhabitant of the boundaries between the world of the living and that of superstition. A figure no one would miss. His face is a fiction. When historians examined the actual trial records, the accusation documents, the interrogation transcripts, the inventories of confiscated goods, and the witness lists, what they found was a radically different image. The victims of the witch hunt did not have a single profile. They had names, varied ages, distinct social positions, and stories that, in many cases, clearly explain why they were denounced. The majority of the accused were women. This is true, but woman is a broad category, and the reality of the trials was far more specific than the stereotype suggests. Midwives and healers were disproportionately represented. These women held a central role in the rural communities of early modern Europe. They presided over births, treated illnesses with herbs and knowledge passed down through generations, and cared for the dying. In an era without professional medicine accessible to the common people, they were figures of immense practical and symbolic power. And power, especially when wielded by women outside recognized institutional structures, was suspect. When a birth went wrong, when a child was born sickly, when a treatment failed, the healer became the nearest and most available explanation. The very knowledge that made her useful to the community also made her vulnerable before it. The line between wisdom and harm in the imagination of the time was far thinner than we would like to think. But healers were not the only ones. Widows who controlled property and inheritance without male guardianship appeared frequently in trial records. Women involved in land disputes with neighbors. Women who had denied requests for loans or help, and whose refusal was later followed by some misfortune. Women described simply as difficult, strong-willed, little inclined toward the submission expected of their time and place. The accusations rarely came from nowhere. They emerged from pre-existing conflicts, from accumulated community tensions, from resentments that found in the vocabulary of witchcraft a socially legitimized form of expression. And there was another fact that the popular narrative consistently omits. Men were also accused, in some regions significantly. In Iceland, more than 90% of those convicted were men. In Finland and Estonia, the proportion also inverted the dominant stereotype. Across Europe as a whole, it is estimated that between 20 and 25% of all those convicted were male. In certain regions of the Holy Roman Empire and Russia, that proportion was even more pronounced. The profile of the accused, therefore, was not determined solely by gender. It was shaped by local dynamics, by the type of accusation predominant in the region, and by the way each specific community understood and applied the concept of witchcraft. There was, however, one mechanism that transcended regional particularities and accounted for a significant part of the scale of the persecutions: the chained confession. Under intense pressure during interrogations, and historical records extensively document both physical and psychological coercive methods, the accused frequently named other supposed accomplices. These names became new targets of investigation, who in turn named others, in a cascade that turned an initial isolated accusation into a process capable of devastating entire communities. There are documented cases of villages where the proportion of adults prosecuted became so high that the courts themselves had to halt the trials, not for lack of suspects, but for lack of sufficient population to keep local life running. This fact illuminates something fundamental. The witch hunt was not merely a phenomenon of individual persecution. It was, in its moments of greatest intensity, a phenomenon of social disintegration, a process that fed on itself, grew with its own internal logic, and transformed collective fear into an instrument of destruction with no apparent breaks. The question historians still debate is, what allowed this process to take hold with such violence in certain regions, while others remained nearly untouched? Why did Spain and Italy, where the Inquisition operated with more structure, have far lower numbers than the Germanic and Scottish regions? The answer, as we shall see, is not where most people would expect to find it. The question seemed simple. Why did certain regions of Europe experience outbreaks of persecution of such intensity that they left permanent marks on communities, while others, under the same Christian faith and in the same era, remained relatively spared? The answer, when articulated by the historians who examined the regional data, revealed a profound irony that still surprises today. The regions most affected by witch hunting were not necessarily those most tightly controlled by the Church. They were frequently the most unstable, the most divided, the most uncertain about who held the authority to define what was sacred and what was diabolical. The key lay in the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther initiated a rupture that would divide European Christianity irreversibly. What followed was not merely a theological debate, it was a long war for the soul of Europe, producing decades of armed conflict, reciprocal persecutions, and a state of collective anxiety with no easy parallel in Western history. And in that climate, the devil became more present than ever. Contrary to popular intuition, the Reformation did not reduce witch-hunting persecutions. It multiplied them. And not because Catholics persecuted witches while Protestants refrained. Both sides did so with comparable vigor. What changed was the structure of religious authority and the dynamics of competition between the confessions. Each side had its own reasons to demonstrate vigilance against the forces of evil, and this competition for orthodoxy fueled persecutions from both directions. Where there was institutional clarity, the intensity of persecution was lower. Spain and Italy, frequently pointed to as centers of inquisitorial terror, were in practice two of the European countries with the lowest number of executions for witchcraft. The reason is revealing. The Spanish and Italian Inquisition was conducted by trained jurists, experienced theologians who applied rigorous standards of proof and were profoundly skeptical of confessions obtained under coercion. The Iberian inquisitors even acquitted the majority of the accused who appeared before their courts. The regions of the Holy Roman Empire experienced a radically different situation. Fragmented into hundreds of principalities, counties, and city-states, many of which had changed faith once or more over the course of the 16th century, these communities frequently operated under local secular courts. These courts had fewer procedural safeguards, were more permeable to community pressure, and tended to conduct trials with far less legal scrutiny than the formalized ecclesiastical courts. The result was devastating. In Germanic territories, the number of executions for witchcraft far exceeded any other region of Europe. Some estimates place more than half of all recorded deaths on the continent during the period there. Scotland offers another revealing example. Under the reign of James VI, who later became James I of England, the country experienced outbreaks of persecution of extraordinary intensity. The monarch himself was a fervent believer in the reality of the threat. He personally wrote a treatise on the subject entitled Demonology, published in 1597. The direct involvement of royal power gave Scottish persecutions a legitimacy and scale that distinguished them from more contained local situations. There was yet another factor frequently neglected: war. The period of greatest intensity in the European persecutions coincided almost exactly with the 30 Years' War, which devastated the continent between 1618 and 1648. Destroyed harvests, displaced communities, weakened authorities, and populations subjected to extreme levels of suffering created an environment ripe for fear to flourish. Where rational explanation failed, where loss seemed arbitrary and meaningless, the logic of witchcraft offered a narrative of causality. Someone was responsible. Someone had made it happen. This human need to name the guilty party, to transform chaos into agency, into deliberate malicious intent, was perhaps the most powerful fuel of the entire persecution machine. And yet at some point this machine stopped. Not all at once, not the same way everywhere, but it stopped, and the story of how it ended is possibly the most instructive part of this entire investigation, because it reveals something about the nature of collective error that still has much to teach us today. How does a society recognize, admit, and confront the fact that it persecuted innocence in the name of truth? That is the question with which the next chapter begins. The machine did not stop by decree. It did not stop because an authority woke up one morning and decided the world had been mistaken. It stopped the way most great historical errors stop. Slowly, unevenly, with resistance and relapses, driven by the painful accumulation of doubts that for decades had not been allowed to be voiced aloud. The first to question were those closest to the process. Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld was a German Jesuit priest who had personally accompanied dozens of condemned individuals to the moment of their deaths in the early years of the 17th century. He was not an external critic. He was a man on the inside of the system, and what he saw transformed him. In 1631, he anonymously published the Cautio Criminalis, a treatise that dismantled with legal and moral rigor the procedures of witch trials. Spee argued that if anyone applied the same methods of interrogation to any innocent person, they would equally obtain a confession. The problem, he said, was not the witch, it was the method. The book circulated cautiously. To question the trials was still in many places a risky position, but the seed had been planted. Throughout the 17th century, other intellectuals built on this foundation. The Dutch theologian Balthasar Bekker published a monumental work in 1691 questioning the very ability of the devil to act in the physical world. If the devil could not influence the human body, the entire theological basis of witchcraft crumbled. The book cost him his ecclesiastical position, but it sold tens of thousands of copies within a few years. In Germany, jurist Christian Thomasius went further. He argued in courts and in his university lectures that torture should be abolished as a method of obtaining evidence. Without torture, chained confessions could not hold. Without chained confessions, collective trials lost their internal logic. There was also a silent shift among the elites. Appellate courts began to reverse convictions more frequently. Standards of proof were raised. The idea that a confession obtained under coercion had legal value began to be questioned not only by theologians, but by lawyers, judges, and rulers. And then came Salem. In 1692, in the colony of Massachusetts, a series of witchcraft accusations triggered one of the most well-known episodes in history. 20 people lost their lives. But what made Salem historically singular was not merely its brutality. It was the speed with which society recognized the error and tried to distance itself from it. When accusations began to reach people of high social standing, when respected figures started being mentioned as suspects, the process collapsed. The court was dissolved. Some judges publicly begged forgiveness. One of the accusers, now an adult, made a confession of remorse years later. Salem did not end the persecutions in Europe, which were already in decline. But it became a symbol of the moment when the mechanism turns against itself and society is forced to see what it preferred not to see. The last major witch trial with an execution recorded in Western Europe took place in Switzerland in 1782. A woman named Anna Goldie lost her life in Glarus, accused of poisoning her employer's daughter. The execution sparked immediate scandal. Centuries later, in 2008, the canton of Glarus officially rehabilitated her memory, recognizing her as a victim of a judicial error. That belated gesture, small in scale, enormous in meaning, encapsulates something essential about this entire story. What this investigation has revealed, chapter by chapter, is not merely the lie about medieval witches. It is something broader and more unsettling. The capacity that every society has to construct an enemy, to systematize it, to legitimize it with the vocabulary of its era, whether theological, legal, or scientific, and to persecute it with the absolute conviction of being on the right side. The Middle Ages did not invent the bonfires. Modernity lit them, and it lit them with the certainty of those who believe themselves enlightened. If this story has a lesson, it is this. Collective error rarely announces itself as error. It arrives dressed as order, as protection, as necessary truth. And that is precisely why knowing it, in detail and without distortion, remains one of the most serious ways to care for the present. If this documentary made you think, question, or simply look at the past with different eyes, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next investigations. Also, leave your comment below. Every perspective you share helps build a community that values history as it really was. And if you've made it this far, someone close to you deserves to see this too. Share it. Truth travels better when it has company.